But here's the deal. These ultradian cycles are actually triggered by fluctuations in the so-called glucocorticoid system, the system that regulates cortisol release. And as some of you have probably heard me say before, cortisol, even though it's often discussed as a terrible thing, it's, chronic stress, cortisol, etc. Cortisol is essential for health. Ultradian rhythms are these 90-minute cycles that we go through from the time that we are born until the time we die. Indeed, even during sleep, we are experiencing and more or less governed by these ultradian rhythms. This question and this answer is not so much about sleep, but just know that when you go to sleep at night until you wake up in the morning, every 90 minutes or so, your patterns of sleep, that is the percentage or ratio rather of slow wave sleep to light sleep to rapid eye movement sleep, changes in a way such that each 90-minute cycle gates the next cycle. It sort of flips the on switch for the next 90-minute cycle, then that 90-minute cycle ends, flips the on switch for the next one, and so on and so forth. I mention all that because during the daytime, the same thing is true, but most people don't know when the 90-minute ultradian cycles begin, because if you think about it, you could wake up on the basis of an alarm clock or noise in the room, or simply because you naturally wake up in the middle of an ultradian 90-minute cycle. So does that mean, for instance, that if you wake up 60 minutes into an ultradian cycle, that the next 30 minutes of your waking, right, because that 60 minutes needs to continue to 90 to complete an ultradian cycle, that the next 30 minutes after waking are related to the ultradian cycle that you were still in during sleep, or does it start a new ultradian cycle? And the answer is the former. That ultradian cycle continues even if you wake up in the middle of it. And so a lot of people who want to leverage ultradian cycles for learning will say, well, how do I know when to start one? Does it start when I hit my stopwatch? Can I just set a clock and work for 90 minutes? And the short answer is no. And that might seem unfortunate, but the good news is that you can figure out when your first proper ultradian cycle of the day begins simply by asking yourself, when are you most alert after waking? That is, if you were, say, to wake up at 7 a.m., and let's say that's the end of an ultradian cycle, or perhaps you're in the middle of an ultradian cycle, doesn't matter. What you need to watch for or pay attention to for a day or so is when you start to experience your greatest state of mental alertness in the morning. And here we can discard with all the issues and variables around caffeine or no caffeine, hydrating or no hydrating. Exercise is one variable that we'll consider in a moment. But here's the deal. These ultradian cycles are actually triggered by fluctuations in the so-called glucocorticoid system, the system that regulates cortisol release. And as some of you have probably heard me say before, cortisol, even though it's often discussed as a terrible thing, it's, chronic stress, cortisol, etc. Cortisol is essential for health. And every day we get a rise in cortisol in the morning that is associated with enhanced immune function, enhanced alertness, enhanced ability to focus, so on and so forth. In fact, the protocol that I'm always beating the drum about, that people should get sunlight in their eyes as close to waking as possible, that actually enhances or increases the peak level of cortisol that's experienced early in the day. And that sets in motion a number of these ultradian cycles. So for instance, if you wake up at 7 a.m. and you find that for the first hour after waking, you tend to be a little bit groggy, or you happen to be groggy on a given day, but then you notice that your attention and alertness starts to peak somewhere around 9:30 a.m. or 10 a.m., you can be pretty sure that that first ultradian cycle for learning is going to be optimal to start at about 9:30 or 10 a.m. But the point is this. These 90-minute cycles occur periodically throughout the day, but there is going to be one period early in the day, and here I'm referring to this period as starting at about 9:30 or 10 a.m., and then likely another one in the mid to late afternoon that are going to be ideal for focused learning. And that focused learning bout should ideally have you set your clock, a stopwatch or something, to measure 90 minutes, but do assume that there's going to be some jitter at the front end where you're not going to be able to focus as deeply as you would like. Then you'll get about an hour of deep focus, and then you really start to transition out of these ultradian cycles. How do you know when the afternoon ultradian cycle occurs? Well, just as in the morning, it occurs because there's a brief but significant increase in the glucocorticoid system in the mid to late afternoon. I wish I could tell you it's going to be 2 p.m. or it's going to be, it's going to be 3 p.m. That's really going to depend on the individual when you ingest caffeine, some of the other demands of your day. But you can learn to recognize when these 2 periods for optimized learning will occur. And here are the key principles. Watch for a day or two, meaning pay attention to when you have your peak levels of physical and mental energy in the morning. That is between waking and noon. And then again, between noon and about 6 or 7 p.m. Although I'm sure that there are some late shifted folks that will experience their peak in focus somewhere around 6 or 7 p.m., especially if they're waking up around 10 or 11 a.m., as I know some people out there are. Once you know where those peaks in focus occur on your schedule, set a stopwatch for 1 ultradian cycle in the early part of the day. In this example, I was saying 9:30, but if you can't hop on it until 10, that's fine. Set it for 90 minutes. Consider that block holy, meaning rule out all other distractions, but assume that within that 90-minute block, you are only going to be able to focus intensely for about 1 hour. And just know that the molecules that control neuroplasticity, and these things have names, and yes, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, is sort of the most famous of those, but there are others as well. In fact, the very receptors that control synaptic strength, the connections between neurons, some of the neurotransmitters and neuromodulators involved in synaptic plasticity, they undergo regulation by these ultradian changes in glucocorticoid. And then try and capture a second ultradian learning block in the afternoon. Again, just knowing that the first 10 or 15 minutes, consider it mental warm-up, and then you get about an hour. It's not exactly 60 minutes, but about an hour to maximize learning. So if you're trying to learn something, really capture it during that phase as well. So for somebody that wants to learn an immense amount of material, or who has the opportunity to capture another ultradian cycle, the other time where that tends to occur is also early days. So some people, by waking up early and using stimulants like caffeine and hydration or some brief high-intensity exercise, can trigger that cortisol pulse to shift a little bit earlier so that they can capture a morning work block that occurs somewhere, let's say, between 6 and 7:30 a.m. So let's think about our typical person, at least in my example, that's waking up around 7 a.m. And then I said, has their first ultradian work cycle really flip on, because that bump in cortisol around 9:30 or 10 a.m. If that person were, say, to set their alarm clock for 5:30 a.m., then get up, get some artificial light if the sun isn't out, turn on bright artificial lights, or if the sun happens to be up that time of year, get some sunlight in your eyes. But irrespective of sunlight, we're to get a little bit of brief high-intensity exercise, maybe 10 or 15 minutes of skipping rope, or even just jumping jacks, or go out for a brief jog. What happens then is the cortisol pulse starts to shift earlier. And so the next day and the following day and so on and so forth, provided they're still doing that exercise first thing, and ideally getting some light in their eyes as well, then they have an opportunity to capture an increase in cortisol that is now shifted from about 7 a.m. to about 8:30 a.m. So they can capture an hour of work there. And then they will also still be within that rising phase of cortisol in the 9:30 to 10 a.m. block that lasts until about 11:30 or so. They might have lunch. Perhaps after lunch, they do a non-sleep deep rest. Maybe they don't. Maybe you're a napper. Maybe you're not. Doesn't really matter. And then in the afternoon, and I would suspect it would now be in the earlier afternoon, sometime around 2 or 2:30 would be typical. Although again, that exact time will vary person to person. Then they would want to schedule another 90-minute work block. So that's how you can capture 3. Now you can start to see also why capturing 4 ultradian work blocks would be exceedingly rare. It's just not typical that people are awake for that much of the day. You have to sleep at some point. And I should mention that if you're going to force yourself to wake up earlier on a consistent basis, you probably should be trying to get to sleep a little bit earlier as well, because it's not just the quality, but the duration of quality sleep that really matters for learning. And I should also remind everybody that the actual rewiring of neurons does not occur during any focused work block. It actually occurs during deep sleep the following night and the following night.
Thanks for watching. If you found this information helpful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more health and wellness tips.